Man, woman, birth, death, infinity.
What you just saw is a clip from the introduction to an ABC program called Ben Casey from the early 1960s. The program reflects the hallowed sense that producers and directors and actors had about the medical system and the ability of doctors to really grapple with life and death and everything in between. I wrote Playing Doctor because I was fascinated by how television tells stories about critical institutions in American society, in this case the medical system. What we have is an institution, television, telling stories about another institution, medicine and healthcare. And what we learn is what goes on behind the scenes when doctors are doing their thing. What's the normative things about medicine that we should care about? How do we know whether doctors are doing the right things or not? Television tells us stories about this. They tell us about what's right and what's wrong, and why doctors are good and when doctors are bad. What's fascinating about this is that the formula really goes back to the 1930s, maybe even before that. And what we have here is a clip from a Dr. Kildare movie from 1941 called Dr. Kildare's Strange Case. And what's fascinating about it is this clip shows what today we would call malpractice.
Dr. Gillespie. Yes, he thinks you're a fine surgeon. Says you have the best hands in the hospital. He said something else, too. He said there are times when we have to act with life in one hand and death in the other. And that the true test of a doctor is his faith in his own judgment, even though he knows someone's going to die if he's wrong.
We'll operate immediately. This patient has refused the operation, but I take full responsibility.
The idea that's reflected in the Kildare clip, that doctors really stand in the center of healthcare and have an enormous amount of power, was transferred to television, and the development of the formula in a Dr. Kildare television show, a Ben Casey show, a show about Marcus Welby, MD, a show called Medical Center. And particularly in Ben Casey, as we see this clip rolling through, you see a commandeering figure, a person who was sure that he was at the center of the universe.
Well, I accuse you, gentlemen, all of you. I accuse the juvenile court judges. I accuse the probation department and its offices. I accuse the sheriff's office and the police department's juvenile division and its offices. I accuse the politicians and the social workers. And while I'm at it, I accuse the members of...
Ben Casey was emblematic of the kind of doctor show that was seen on television in the 1950s and 60s and into the 1970s. A program in which medicine was seen to be basically hospital-based. It was seen to be doctor-centered. There was no such thing as scarce resources. And the illnesses they dealt with were essentially acute. These were ideas about what medicine was about and where Americans should consider putting more and more resources into medicine for. Even though by the 1970s, policymakers began to say, hey, this may be the wrong way to go. In fact, medicine is not an unlimited resource. People are getting older and chronic diseases are coming in. Maybe we shouldn't keep shipping everyone to the hospital. Maybe private practice internists are important. So what we see here is a beginning of a real separation between policymakers' view of medicine and television's view of medicine, which is wedded to a formula that seems to be working. That basic idea of acute, really gripping medicine doesn't change through the 1970s. What does change is that all of a sudden, instead of the patients being the focus, which was the crux of the issue in the Ben Casey era, the Dr. Kildare era, the Marcus Welby era, instead of the patient being the focus and the doctor solves the patient's problems, all of a sudden with MASH, it flips around. and the doctors are the ones with problems. Here you have these physicians in the middle of a war. It was the Korean War, but everyone really saw it as the Vietnam War. They're good doctors. They have to deal with emergency operations. But the focus isn't on the patients. The focus is on the pain that they feel, together with the humor that they have to survive with in order to be able to do their jobs. And the success of MASH led to a frenzied attempt by producers to try to figure out how they could capture that magic. It didn't always work, but into the 1980s, more and more, for television reasons, having to do with audience considerations and other things like that, the focus moved away from the patient to the physician. And more you had dramas about yuppie physicians and their problems in the middle of the hospital, and how many times patients were causing the doctor's problems. There's a real similarity in many ways between the doctor shows that are fiction that are evolving in the 1980s and 90s and the reality shows like Untold Tales of the ER that shows up on cable stations.
Looks like we might have a fractured pelvis. We're doing your toes. Very good, very good.
In the most popular programs, for example in Grey's Anatomy, what we have is a real focus on the angst of the physicians, on their sexual lives, on the idea that really you don't have to get to know the patient all that well in order to diagnose their disease and solve their problems.
She's a mess. She's got meningitis, seizures. She's just going to live a short and painful life.
You don't know that.
It is my job to know that.
You're not God, Derek.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry, honey, but you're not. You don't get to decide.
Wait, did you just call me honey? What? Don't call me honey.
Fine, you're not God, Dr. Shepard. Look, if a patient has any chance at survival, which I think she does, then you have a responsibility.
Man, don't talk to me about responsibility.
You took an oath, Derek.
Oh, and don't you dare talk to me about oaths.
Derek, I messed up. People mess up.
You slept with my best friend in my favorite sheets.
The flannel sheets? You hate the flannel sheets.
I love the sheets.
You like the Italian
I did.
sheets with the
Would you
paisleys.
just stop talking
Fine.
about the sheets?
I'm sorry, I'm just gonna go. I'll go check on the labs.
Madison, don't do this.
Derek, look, she's a fighter. Look how far she's come already.
Don't get attached. Don't get involved.
The people who work in television on these programs are much more concerned about the drama, much more concerned about what the audience thinks. They see what they're doing as dramatic license. What they're most concerned about when it comes to realism is the realism of the description of the diseases, the pharmaceuticals that people get, because they don't want to give people the wrong impression, and the realism of the operating room. So they go to a lot of trouble trying to figure out how do you hold the scalpels. The people who worked on these programs, as the book goes into some detail about, really care not to be wrong about the particulars of medicine, but they have no interest in talking about the politics of medicine, the changes in the medical system, the idea that medicine is a scarce resource. They try to get around those issues by talking about other things. There were exceptions, one of which was a comedy program called Scrubs that was really popular with residents and interns. Scrubs every now and again did deal with issues of access to care and insurance and economics, but it did that on a very superficial level. And that was true about all television programs about medicine in prime time. Essentially, the idea of politics and economics and insurance was marginalized from the formula. The formula on television becomes a kind of tyranny, which is locked into a certain perspective about healthcare and about doctors. It certainly changes, but some basic things are enduring. People who view these programs may have a very strange notion of how things ought to be. Okay? They watch the news and they know there are problems. Okay? But they look behind the scenes on these programs and the problems are interpreted very differently. And so there's a clash of insights here. And it leads, I would suggest, to some real tensions about how people can think of the medical system and what should its future be.